In this video series about rigid body dynamics, we'll be using a catapult scene, but first I'd like to introduce you to some of the core concepts and workflows around rigid body dynamics so that you'll kind of have a sense of what you're doing before we get into a real scene. So, apropos of that, the first thing that we would like to do, as always, is to create a project folder. This may be a review for you, but we need to go through the motions just in case. We'll go to the File menu, and the project item, you'll see there's New, Edit, Current, and Set. If I go to Edit Current, it'll tell me what my current project is. I've just got the default project in my current user's Documents folder. Okay, so I'll make a new project just directly alongside that one, just next door to it. File Project New. So in that default Maya Projects folder, I will make a new project. I'll call it a catapult project. If I needed to, I could browse for another location, but I'll just use this one that's set aside for me. Click the Use Default button at the bottom of the dialog to populate all the fields with the appropriate folder names, and then click Accept. So the project has now been created. And in fact, if I go to my Windows Explorer window, we can open that up. Here's my home directory, my documents, Maya, projects, and now you'll see I've got two. I've got the default one and I've got my new one that I've just made. So if I drill down into there, you'll see I've got a new valid project structure created. Very good. So back to Maya. Before we even begin to think about building our scene, we need to settle on a scale convention, because literally size matters. If you build your scene to the wrong scale, you won't get accurate results in your simulation and it won't look realistic. So you need to get your head wrapped around this first. How big is your scene? I'm going to make a sort of tabletop scene that's about 2 meters wide, so pretty small. I first want to go into my preferences in Window Settings, Preferences. And in that dialog, I just want to check in on my linear working units. So I'll go to the Settings section, and working units are currently set to centimeters. And I advise that you leave it at centimeters. Even if you need to build a scene that's very large, like a whole city, I would recommend leaving this at centimeters, but then building a scale model of your city. That would be maybe 1/100th size. So if you change the linear working units, you may incur some round-off errors. In other words, you may have inaccuracies in your scene if you don't know what you're doing with this. So I'm going to leave it at centimeters, and that's what I advise you do as well. The grid is another matter. I want to just set the grid up so that it's approximately the same size as my stage or the action in my scene. So I'll go into the display menu under Grid, choose the Options box. And as you can see here, I've got the default grid that comes with the factory settings of Maya. And it's only 12 units from center to edge, or 12 centimeters from center to edge. And currently, each one of these grid squares equals 1 unit, or 1 centimeter. And I can tell that because it says here, I've got a grid line every 5 units and then a subdivision of 5. So I'm going to get a major grid line every 5 units and a subdivision line every 5 divided by 5, or every 1 units. This is a little bit clearer if I change the grid lines and numbers color to something else. Press Apply, and you'll see, okay, now this is a major grid line every 5 units, and these minor grid lines are every 5 divided by 5. I'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's make this, let's say, 150 centimeters from center to edge. Give me a grid line every 100 units, and then subdivide that by 10. Hit Apply, and I can close that as well. And now I've got a stage that's about 300 centimeters on a side. It's 150 from center to edge. So this is about 3 meters here. Cool, so I've got my grid set up. Then I can go ahead and start building some geometry, once again at real-world scale, or 1-to-1 scale. I'll create a ground plane with a polygon primitive plane. Just drag on the grid. I'll immediately zero out the translates, type in a 0 there. I'll go in Input Polyplane 1, And I'll just set both the width and the height to 200 centimeters or 2 meters. I'll click in the viewport to give that focus and press the 5 key so I can see the shading. Cool, so I've got my ground plane and it's 200 centimeters on a side. I'll also create a polygon primitive sphere of approximately, let's say, 15 centimeters in radius. I'll move that up. I'll create a polygon primitive cone as well, and polygon primitive cube. Now, by the way, rigid bodies will work with NURBS. I'm just opting not to use NURBS in this case because it's a little bit cleaner and neater. Some NURBS primitives are actually constructed out of more than one object and simply grouped together, so that gets a little bit messy. So it's easier to work with polygons.